There's a moment every narcissist experiences privately that almost no one ever gets to witness. Not the moment the relationship ends, not the dramatic final argument, not even the moment you go no contact. It's later than that, quieter than that. It's the moment they finally fully understand that the game itself is over. Not this specific round of it, not this particular attempt at reconciliation, but the entire structure of push and pull, testing and retreating, hoovering and discarding that's defined every significant relationship in their adult life. And their reaction to that realization when it finally arrives is almost nothing like what people imagine. If you've spent any time in this niche, you've probably pictured this moment before, maybe more than once. Some version of a dramatic reckoning, tears, a genuine apology, a devastating realization delivered directly to you, the vindication of finally watching someone understand exactly what they did. I want to walk you through what actually happens instead, because the real version is stranger, quieter, and in some ways more revealing than anything the fantasy version could offer. Let's start by defining what the game actually is, because understanding its structure is the only way to understand what its ending actually means to someone whose entire relational life has been organized around it. The game, in this context, isn't a single manipulation tactic or a specific behavior. It's the entire operating system underneath a narcissist's relationships. The continuous cycle of establishing a source of supply, testing its limits, extracting what's needed from it, and either maintaining it through careful management or discarding it once a better source becomes available. This cycle is run, in one form or another, through nearly every significant relationship a narcissist has ever had, often since early adulthood, sometimes since adolescence. It isn't experienced by them as a game in the cynical, deliberate sense the word implies. It's simply how relationships have always worked, as far as their psychology understands the concept. Here's what makes this cycle so remarkably durable across an entire lifetime. It has almost always eventually worked. Even relationships that ended badly, even partners who left angry and hurt, typically left room somewhere for the game to continue. A slow fade rather than a clean break. A mutual friend group keeping the door slightly open. An eventual message once enough time had passed and the sting had faded enough to make renewed contact feel safe again. This durability is what makes the game feel, to a narcissist, less like a strategy they're consciously running and more like an immutable law of how relationships function. Not something to question, simply something that's always reliably been true. This is why the actual ending of the game, not a single lost relationship, but the recognition that the entire structure has finally, permanently failed, represents something categorically different from any ordinary heartbreak or rejection they've experienced before. It isn't the loss of one person. It's the collapse of an entire operating assumption about how the world works, an assumption that's never previously been seriously tested because it never previously needed to be. Every earlier version of loss came with an implicit escape hatch. This version doesn't. So what actually triggers this recognition? It's rarely a single relationship ending, even a significant one. It's usually cumulative. A pattern that becomes undeniable only after enough repetitions across enough different people, enough different attempts at running the same cycle, produce the same increasingly unmistakable result. It doesn't work anymore. The empath who used to absorb months of testing before finally painfully arriving at boundaries now arrives there in weeks. The new partner who used to take years to recognize the pattern now recognizes it after a handful of months, sometimes faster, informed by a cultural conversation about manipulation and abuse that simply didn't exist with the same depth or accessibility in previous decades. The friends who used to unquestioningly accept the narcissist's version of events now ask harder questions, informed by their own growing awareness of these patterns, sometimes informed directly by conversations with people the narcissist has already burned through. This accumulation eventually reaches a threshold, different for every individual but real and consistent in its eventual arrival, where the pattern becomes impossible to keep explaining away as bad luck, difficult people, or a string of unfortunate coincidences. And this is where the actual secret reaction begins, and it's worth understanding in careful stages, because it unfolds nothing like the dramatic reckoning most people imagine. The first stage of this reaction is disorientation, and it's worth understanding how genuinely destabilizing this is for someone whose entire relational life has operated according to a single, unquestioned set of rules. Imagine for a moment having played the same game your entire life, with enough success that you never had reason to question its fundamental rules, only to discover, gradually and then all at once, that the rules simply don't apply anymore. Not because you're playing badly, you're running the exact same plays that always worked before, because the game itself, the entire underlying structure, has stopped functioning the way it always did. This produces a kind of confusion that goes far deeper than ordinary romantic disappointment, because it isn't just one loss being processed. It's the failure of an entire framework for understanding how relationships, connection, and their own value within them are supposed to work. This disorientation rarely gets expressed directly because expressing it would require an admission most narcissists are constitutionally unable to make, that something about their fundamental approach might be flawed, rather than simply unlucky in its recent execution. Instead, it tends to surface sideways in behavior that looks, from the outside, disconnected from its actual source. A general irritability that seems to have no clear trigger. A restlessness that follows them into situations that should, by any reasonable measure, be comfortable and secure. An increasing intolerance for minor frustrations that wouldn't have registered as significant a few years earlier, back when the game was still reliably producing the results it was designed to produce. Here's what's worth understanding about this stage specifically, because it explains a pattern that often confuses people trying to make sense of a narcissist's behavior during this period. The disorientation frequently gets directed outward, toward increasingly broad and increasingly bitter explanations for why the game has stopped working. It's not that their approach has ever needed examining. It's that people have gotten colder, more difficult, less willing to extend basic understanding and patience. It's that everyone's too sensitive now, that modern relationships have become impossible, that something has gone wrong with an entire generation of potential partners rather than with the single, unchanging variable present in every one of these failed attempts. This externalization serves an important protective function because it allows the disorientation to be processed as an observation about the world rather than a genuinely threatening piece of information about the narcissist's own approach to relationships. This first stage can last a remarkably long time, sometimes years, precisely because the externalization is so effective at deflecting the deeper recognition trying to surface underneath it. But the disorientation doesn't actually resolve through this deflection. It simply gets managed temporarily, the same way every other uncomfortable truth in a narcissist's internal world tends to get managed. Pushed to the margins, blamed on external circumstances, revisited only in moments too private and too fleeting to ever fully process. Eventually, though, and this is where the second stage begins, usually only after the externalization strategy has been tested against enough evidence that it starts to genuinely strain, something shifts that's harder to keep pushing outward. This second stage is what researchers studying narcissistic collapse sometimes describe as the erosion of the compensatory narrative, and it's worth understanding carefully, because it's the stage where the secret reaction starts to become, for the first time, something closer to genuine internal reckoning, even if it never fully arrives at honest accountability. Here's what triggers this shift specifically: the externalization strategy. Everyone's too sensitive, everyone's changed, the world has become impossible, requires a constant supply of fresh evidence to keep functioning credibly, even to an audience of one. Each new failed relationship needs its own explanation, its own version of the story where the narcissist remains blameless and the world remains at fault. This works reasonably well when failures are spaced out, when there's enough time between them to construct a satisfying narrative before the next one arrives. It works much less well once the failures start compounding faster than the explanations can keep pace with them, once relationships that should, by any reasonable measure, have taken years to unravel start ending in months, then weeks, each one requiring its own increasingly strained justification. This is where something genuinely uncomfortable starts to surface, something the externalization strategy was specifically designed to prevent from ever fully forming. a nagging, persistent, and increasingly difficult to suppress awareness that the common denominator across every single failed attempt has never actually been the world, the timing, or the specific flaws of each individual partner. It's been them. This awareness doesn't usually arrive as a clean, articulate thought. Narcissistic psychology, remember, is specifically structured to prevent exactly this kind of direct, threatening realization from forming coherently. It arrives instead as a persistent unease, a restlessness that follows them into situations that should feel comfortable, a quality of dissatisfaction that no longer responds reliably to the usual remedies. New attention, new admiration, new sources of supply that used to reliably restore equilibrium and increasingly don't manage to anymore. This is the stage where you'll often hear, through mutual connections or through the narcissist's own social media, language that sounds almost like self-reflection, but functions on closer examination as something quite different, performed insight, calibrated more for how it sounds to an audience than as evidence of genuine internal change. Posts about growth, about learning to be better, about vague, unspecified past mistakes that never quite name what actually happened or who was actually harmed. This language often gets mistaken by people watching from a distance for real accountability finally emerging. And I want to address this directly because it matters enormously for how you interpret it if you encounter it yourself. Vague, unspecific acknowledgement of past mistakes, delivered to a broad audience rather than to the specific people harmed, functions primarily as reputation management, not genuine reckoning. Real accountability tends to get more specific over time, not less, because real understanding of harm caused typically deepens with honest reflection rather than staying comfortably vague indefinitely. But here's what's genuinely significant about this stage. Even when the public performance remains vague and self-serving, the private discomfort underneath it is often real, even when it never translates into the kind of change an empath watching from a distance might hope to eventually witness. This is worth understanding as its own category of consequence, separate from whether it ever produces visible growth. A person who has spent their entire adult life running a strategy that reliably worked, watching that strategy fail with increasing speed and increasing frequency, experiences something genuinely uncomfortable, even if that discomfort never resolves into the kind of accountability that would actually make things right with anyone they've harmed. This brings us to the third and final stage of the secret reaction, the one that arrives, for those narcissists who reach it at all, only after the second stage has run its course without producing meaningful change. And it's worth being honest that many narcissists never actually reach this third stage, remaining instead in an extended, sometimes permanent version of the second, cycling between externalization and brief flickers of discomfort without ever crossing into something more complete. For the smaller number who do reach it, this final stage looks less like a single dramatic reckoning and more like a kind of quiet, resigned adaptation, not to becoming a fundamentally different person capable of genuine intimacy, but to a permanently lowered set of expectations about what relationships can offer them going forward. This adaptation often manifests as a kind of settling, accepting a relationship that provides less than what the game in its prime used to reliably deliver, because the alternative, continuing to run a strategy that keeps failing faster and more visibly, has become too exhausting or too reputationally costly to sustain indefinitely. This isn't growth in any meaningful sense. It's exhaustion, dressed up as maturity, often described by the narcissist themselves, and sometimes by people around them who don't have full context, as finally settling down or finally growing up. Language that implies a positive chosen evolution rather than what it more often actually represents. A person who has simply run out of viable alternatives and adjusted their expectations downward to match a shrinking pool of options. I want to be honest about something important here, because it matters for how you hold all of this information. This three-stage process, when it happens at all, unfolds over years, sometimes over a decade or more, and it happens almost entirely without your involvement or awareness. You are very unlikely to ever witness these stages directly, and you're even less likely to receive any kind of confirmation, direct or indirect, about which stage a specific narcissist has reached at any given time. This isn't a story that resolves into a satisfying, observable conclusion you get to watch unfold from a front row seat. It's a private, largely invisible process that happens on its own timeline, disconnected almost entirely from your own life and your own healing. And this is exactly where the real value of understanding this process actually lives, not in the satisfaction of imagining a narcissist's private reckoning in detail, but in what this entire framework should ultimately release you from needing. Because here's the truth worth sitting with as we bring this story to a close. You were never going to get to watch this unfold. Not the disorientation, not the erosion of the compensatory narrative, not even the quiet, exhausted settling that sometimes arrives years later for the narcissists who reach that third stage at all. This entire process happens in a room you don't have access to, on a timeline you'll never be given, with an outcome you may never receive confirmation of, no matter how long you wait or how carefully you watch for signs of it through mutual connections. This is worth understanding clearly because it changes what this knowledge is actually for. If you're holding on to this framework, hoping it will eventually deliver the satisfaction of confirmed evidence, a message from a mutual friend describing exactly the disorientation we've discussed, a social media post that finally reads as genuine rather than performed insight, some unmistakable sign that the reckoning has definitively arrived. You're likely to be disappointed, not because the process isn't real, but because its privacy is part of its actual nature. It was never designed to be witnessed by the people it concerns most. That's precisely what makes it so difficult for a narcissist to escape, and precisely what makes it something you'll almost certainly never get to see confirmed. What this knowledge is actually for, instead, is something quieter and, I'd argue, far more useful. Releasing you from the specific kind of waiting that keeps so many empaths tethered to a story that ended long ago. Because here's what happens when you don't have this framework, when you don't understand that this process is happening privately, invisibly, on a timeline entirely disconnected from your own life. You tend to fill the silence with your own uncertainty. Did anything I went through even register? Does the pattern ever actually catch up with them? Or do they simply get away with it forever, moving from person to person without consequence, while I'm the only one who ever had to sit with what happened? This uncertainty, left unaddressed, has a way of quietly undermining your own healing, because it keeps some part of your attention oriented toward a question you were never actually going to get to answer with certainty. Understanding the three-stage process we've walked through today doesn't answer that question definitively either. I want to be honest about that, because false certainty isn't actually more helpful than honest uncertainty. What it does instead is something different and, I think, more valuable. It tells you that the process is very likely happening, in some form, following a pattern consistent enough across different individuals and different relationships that it's reasonable to trust it's unfolding roughly the way we've described, even though you'll probably never receive direct confirmation of it. This is enough. It has to be enough because it's genuinely all that's actually available to you, and building your peace around anything more than this, around needing direct confirmation, around waiting for a message or a mutual friend's report or some unmistakable public sign, keeps you in exactly the kind of limbo this entire video is meant to help you release. Here's what I want you to actually take from this, more than any of the specific psychological mechanics we've discussed today. The game ending for them was never actually the thing your own peace depended on, even though understanding that it does end, eventually, in its own private and largely invisible way, can offer a certain kind of quiet validation. Your peace was always available through a much more direct, much more reliable route, not waiting for their game to end, but ending your own participation in it completely, regardless of what stage they're currently moving through or whether they ever reach the third stage at all. This is the actual final reframe worth carrying forward from everything we've discussed. The narcissist's secret reaction to the game ending is real, and it unfolds, for most of them, roughly the way we've described. Disorientation, followed by an eroding narrative that increasingly can't keep pace with accumulating evidence, followed for a smaller number by an exhausted settling into diminished expectations rather than genuine transformation. But this entire process was always going to happen on its own private timeline, disconnected from yours, unwitnessed by you, and largely unconfirmable no matter how long you wait for evidence of it. Your own game, the one where your peace depended on knowing theirs had ended, was always the one actually within your power to end, on your own timeline, without waiting for any confirmation from a story you were never going to get to fully witness anyway. They may reach the third stage. They may spend the rest of their life cycling through the first two, externalizing endlessly, never quite arriving at the exhausted settling that at least resembles consequence, even if it never resembles growth. You don't get to know which outcome is theirs, and you were never actually required to know in order for your own healing to be complete. The game ends for them privately, eventually, on a timeline you'll never see. Yours already ended the moment you stopped needing to watch for the proof.